Chapter 1. The First Bite. The air in the Meadowview Mall food court on a typical Saturday afternoon was thick with the scent of deep-fried dough, charred pepperoni, and the cheap citrus cleaner the janitorial staff used to wipe down the circular Formica tables. A low, persistent hum hung over the open space, composed of hundreds of overlapping conversations, the clatter of plastic trays, and the faint, artificial cheer of synthesized pop music piping through the ceiling grates. It was a comforting, brainless drone, the background soundtrack to suburban adolescence. At a corner table, beneath the dusty fronds of a dying artificial palm tree, Mia picked at the hardened crust of a pepperoni slice. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy ponytail, and her hazel eyes scanned the lazy crowd of shoppers drifting from store to store. Opposite her, Jake leaned back in his plastic chair, his worn jacket slung over one shoulder and his baseball cap turned backward. He watched her with a quiet amusement. "You're not going to eat that?" Jake asked, pointing a finger at the remaining crust. Mia flicked a grease-stained napkin at his face. "If you eat any more, you're going to turn into a pepperoni." Jake caught the napkin out of the air with an easy athletic motion, tossing it back onto the pile of trash in the center of the table. "Hey, growth spurt. I need the calories." Beside him, Olivia adjusted her glasses, her blonde hair pinned up in a neat bun. She was staring down at a pile of shopping bags resting against her sneakers. "You guys have no appreciation for the art of the bargain. Those shoes were 50% off, and they're practically classic." Liam, wearing his gray hoodie, leaned over his empty soda cup, chewing lazily on a plastic straw. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the sticky tabletop, perfectly out of sync with the tinny music overhead. The only art here was how they managed to play the same 5 terrible songs on loop without the staff going completely insane. The table vibrated slightly as a group of toddlers ran past, laughing and trailing helium balloons. For a moment, it was just another mundane weekend afternoon, the kind they had spent 100 times before, suspended in the harmless boredom of 16-year-olds with nowhere else to go. Then, a sharp, piercing shriek cut through the ambient noise, echoing from the atrium near Gigabyte Electronics. Mia's head snapped toward the sound. The hum of the food court died instantly, replaced by an abrupt, uneasy silence that rippled through the tables. Across the tiled walkway, the wide glass entrance of the electronics store was framed by flashing blue television screens. Inside, a violent struggle was unfolding. A man in a torn, dirt-caked flannel shirt was lunging at Marcus Devlin, one of the mall's regular security guards. The attacker's skin was an unnatural mottled gray, resembling spoiled meat under the harsh store lighting. Marcus was trying desperately to push the man away, his hands shoved against the stranger's chest, but his boots kept slipping on the polished floor. "Get off me!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic. With a heavy thud, Marcus's black walkie-talkie slipped from his belt, hitting the tile with a high-pitched squeal of static. Before the guard could recover his footing, the gray-skinned man clamped his teeth directly into Marcus's forearm. Mia stood up so fast her plastic chair squeaked violently against the floor, drawing startled looks from nearby families. She watched in horror as a spray of dark blood hit the white tiles. The attacker shook his head side to side, tearing through the guard's uniform sleeve and the flesh beneath like a wild animal. "What is he doing?" Olivia breathed, her fingers clutching the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jake stood next, his face pale but his expression hardening. "Whoa!" He reached out and grabbed Mia's wrist, pulling her back a step. "Mia, don't. Stay here." In the atrium, Marcus screamed again, a sound of pure agony that dissolved into a wet choke. The crowd around the electronics store suddenly broke. A wave of panicked shoppers began to run, abandoning strollers, shopping bags, and half-eaten meals. The stampede had begun. On the floor, Marcus's body convulsed violently. His arms twitched, his back arching off the ground in a series of horrific, unnatural spasms. Within seconds, the movement stopped. The gray-skinned attacker was already turning toward a nearby clothing store, but Marcus was not dead. The guard pushed himself up, his eyes now completely milky and devoid of pupils. He let out a low, guttural rattle from his throat. The food court erupted into absolute chaos. The sound of hundreds of heavy footsteps shook the floor. Metal chairs clattered and fell as people fled toward the main exits, their screams merging into a deafening wall of noise. The resurrected guard lunged forward with terrifying speed, slamming into a woman in a bright yellow coat. He sank his teeth into her shoulder, ignoring her desperate screams as they both crashed into a plastic trash bin. "We need to move!" Liam shouted over the din, his voice cracking. Jake yanked Olivia's arm, forcing her to look away from the horror. "This way! Now!" They scrambled away from the open center of the food court, pushed and jostled by the fleeing crowd. Jake guided them toward the side corridor near the entrance of Playtime Palace, a large toy store. Mia kept pace, her pulse racing against her ribs as she tripped over a discarded shopping bag, but managed to keep her footing. Beside her, Liam stumbled, knocking over a plastic mannequin from a window display. The hollow torso hit the ground with a loud clatter. They ducked behind a heavy circular clothing rack stuffed with winter coats just outside the toy store entrance. Through the gaps between the hanging jackets, Mia peered back at the food court. The space was unrecognizable. Tables were overturned, spilled sodas formed dark, sticky puddles across the floor, and more people were falling. Marcus, his uniform soaked in his own blood, was already scanning the room for his next target. "There are more of them," Jake muttered, his hand gripping the metal bar of the clothing rack. "They're coming out of the lower level." "We can't go to the main exits," Liam said, his curly hair damp with sweat. "Everyone is bottlenecked to the front doors. We'll get crushed or caught." Mia pointed a trembling finger toward the dark hallway at the back of the food court. "The storage room. The employees use it for deliveries. It has a heavy, insulated steel door." "Are you sure?" Olivia asked, pushing her glasses up her nose. Her hands were shaking violently, but her voice remained remarkably steady. "It's our best shot," Mia whispered, her hazel eyes darting between her friends. "If we get locked inside, we can wait until the police clear the mall." Jake nodded, his jaw set. He parted a pair of heavy winter coats and peered into the main aisle of the toy store. "Path looks clear, but we have to cross through the display floor to reach the back hallway." As they prepared to move, Olivia gasped, grabbing Mia's sleeve. She pointed toward the adjacent aisle of Playtime Palace. A thin, gray-skinned woman in a shredded dress was standing over a fallen display. The creature was bent over a plastic child-sized mannequin, its fingers clawing uselessly at the hard plastic arm, trying to bite into the synthetic material. The sight was deeply unsettling, a mindless, ravenous drive devoid of any human intelligence. "We can't let her see us," Liam murmured, dropping low. "Keep down. Crawl." Mia dropped to her hands and knees. The carpet beneath her palm was damp and smelled of spilled soda and dirt.
She crawled forward, keeping her head below the level of the shelving units. Jake followed immediately behind her, with Olivia and Liam bringing up the rear. They moved slowly through the aisles of the toy store, navigating a maze of colorful boxes, board games, and stuffed animals. The cheerful, bright packaging of the toys stood in sickening contrast to the bloody smears on the linoleum floor up ahead. Liam led them around a display of building blocks, his movements cautious. He stopped suddenly, raising a hand. Just ahead of them lay a motionless body, a mall employee face down in a pool of dark, spreading blood. Mia squeezed her eyes shut for a second, forcing herself to breathe through her nose to avoid the metallic taste of blood hanging in the air. To their left, a sudden rustle made them freeze. A male zombie, its face mangled and its shirt soaked in crimson, turned its head toward their aisle. Its milky eyes locked onto Olivia. It let out a dry, rasping hiss and began to drag itself forward, its sneakers squeaking on the slick floor. Jake didn't hesitate. He spotted an aluminum baseball bat resting against a nearby sports display. He snatched it, his grip tightening around the rubber handle. Standing tall, he stepped in front of Olivia. As the zombie lunged, Jake swung the bat with all the force in his broad shoulders. The aluminum connected with the side of the creature's skull with a sickening wet crack. The force of the blow vibrated visibly up Jake's arms. The zombie's head jerked violently to the side, and it collapsed instantly onto a pile of action figures, motionless. Mia clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a cry. The sudden violence left them all breathless. "We have to go," Liam urged, his eyes wide. "That noise is going to bring more." From the front entrance of the toy store, several low, guttural groans responded to the metallic clang of the bat. More of the gray-skinned figures began to spill through the entrance of Playtime Palace, drawn by the sound of the impact.
Their pale eyes scanned the aisles, their limbs twitching with a terrible, single-minded purpose. Olivia spotted a bright red fire extinguisher mounted on the drywall next to a display of board games. "Jake, cover me," she urged. She reached up, tearing the heavy metal cylinder from its bracket. She yanked the yellow plastic safety pin free, her fingers steady despite the terror, and aimed the black nozzle at the advancing cluster of ghouls. "Get back!" Olivia yelled. She squeezed the lever. A deafening hiss erupted from the nozzle as a massive, pressurized cloud of white chemical retardant sprayed into the aisle. The thick fog expanded instantly, completely swallowing the nearest 3 zombies in a choking white wall. Jake grabbed Liam's shoulder, shoving him toward the back of the store. "Go! Go! Go!" Mia coughed violently, the sharp chemical smell burning her throat. She waved a hand in front of her face, trying to clear her vision as they ran blind through the freezing white mist. The muffled groans of the undead grew faint behind the dense barrier. Through the haze, the red exit sign above the rear corridor finally appeared. Mia threw her weight against the push bar of the heavy wooden door, and they tumbled into the back hallway. They scrambled down the narrow concrete corridor, their sneakers squeaking against the painted floor. At the end of the hall stood the heavy, insulated door of the cold storage room. Mia grabbed the handle, throwing it open, and the group piled inside. Jake and Liam immediately turned, slamming the thick door shut against the frame. "Help me with this," Liam panted, pointing to a massive industrial metal shelving unit loaded with heavy boxes of paper cups and cleaning supplies. Together, Jake and Liam grabbed the metal frame. They hauled it across the doorway, the metal legs screeching loudly against the concrete floor.
The shelving unit settled flush against the door, effectively blocking any attempt to push it open from the outside. Mia collapsed against a stack of large burlap potato bags, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The cold, sterile air of the room instantly bit into her skin, a sharp contrast to the humid, sweat-soaked atmosphere of the mall. Olivia stepped toward the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the heavy brass deadbolt. With a firm twist, she threw the lock. The click of the deadbolt felt like a temporary shield against the nightmare outside. The room was dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a yellow wire in the center of the ceiling. The air smelled of damp earth, stored potatoes, and old cardboard. From the other side of the heavy door, the distant, muffled sounds of screams and crashing metal still reached them, but the barrier held firm. "Everyone look at me," Jake said, his voice low but firm. He pulled a small silver flashlight from his jacket pocket and clicked it on, the bright beam cutting through the dimness. "We need to check, make sure no one got scratched or bitten." He stepped toward Mia, his expression tight. He ran the beam of light down her arms, gently pulling back the sleeves of her hoodie to inspect her pale skin. Mia held her breath, watching the light dance over her wrists. Finding nothing, Jake let out a long breath. Olivia walked over to Liam. "Hold still," she murmured. She reached up, gently lifting the collar of his gray hoodie to inspect his neck and shoulders, checking for any hidden tears or marks. Liam stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. "You're clean," Olivia confirmed, her shoulders dropping in relief. Mia stepped toward Olivia, reaching out to gently tilt her friend's chin upward. She used her sleeve to wipe a smudge of dark soot and chemical residue from Olivia's cheek. "You're okay, too." They exchanged shaky, relieved exhales, the immediate panic beginning to subside into a cold, exhausting reality. "No bites," Mia whispered, looking at each of them. "We're okay. We made it." Suddenly, the overhead speaker of the mall's PA system gargled. A high-pitched squeal of feedback echoed through the room, followed by a distorted, frantic voice. "Attention all shoppers. This is an official. Seek shelter immediately. Do not attempt to..." The voice was cut off by a harsh burst of static, and then the speaker died entirely, leaving them in a heavy, suffocating silence. A faint, static-laced hiss broke the silence, coming not from the ceiling, but from a dusty metal shelf near the back of the room. Mia stepped toward the sound, her boots crunching slightly on the concrete. Sitting among a pile of old clipboards was a small, battery-powered janitor's radio. She snatched it up, her fingers quickly finding the plastic dial. She spun it slowly, filtering through waves of white noise. "Repeat, this is an emergency broadcast," a tinny, frantic voice announced through the speaker.
The outbreak has bypassed all initial containment protocols. Local authorities have lost control of the metropolitan area. A citywide quarantine is now in effect. Jake stepped closer, his jaw tight as he leaned in to hear. Olivia and Liam held their breath, the room so quiet that the low hum of the freezer compressor sounded like a war. The military is establishing a secured quarantine zone at the eastern outskirts, near the state highway intersection, the broadcaster continued, the signal wavering. Citizens are advised to avoid major roads and make their way to the coordinates 6-2. Repeat, 6-2. The radio sputtered, the voice dissolving into a high-pitched whine of dead static. Mia turned the dial back and forth, but only white noise answered. She looked up, her hazel eyes meeting Jake's. The reality of their situation settled over them like a physical wake.
They were trapped in a mall, surrounded by monsters, and the entire city was falling. Mia's gaze shifted to a large, faded delivery map of the county pinned to the corkboard on the wall. A red circle marked the Meadowview Mall, and several miles to the east lay the highway intersection. "The military is there," Mia said, her voice small but steadying as she pointed to the map. "We can't stay here forever. We have to get there." Jake looked from the map back to Mia, a grim resolve forming in his eyes. He tightened his grip on the aluminum bat. They were alone, but they had a destination. Chapter 2. The Dripping Dark. The heavy hum of the compressor was gone, replaced by the suffocating silence of the cold storage room. Under the flickering, pale yellow glare of a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed cord, Mia, Jake, Olivia, and Liam sat huddled on upturned plastic milk crates. The air was thick with the musty odor of ancient earth and the sharp, slightly sweet scent of rotting potatoes left behind in a corner bin. A relentless, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the heavy metal door, the dull, flat strike of weight slamming against the outside steel, accompanied by the low, wet gurgling of throats that no longer knew how to breathe. Liam knelt by a water-warped cardboard box tucked beneath a rusted wire shelf. His fingers, trembling slightly, tore back the damp flaps. 6 bottles, he muttered, his voice barely louder than a breath. He lined them up on the concrete floor like glass soldiers, followed by 4 foil-wrapped protein bars. That's it. That's all we've got. And this door? He looked up at the heavy metal shelving unit they had dragged across the entrance. It isn't going to save us. Olivia sat nearby, her back pressed against a stack of flour sacks. She unfolded a crinkled, yellowed piece of paper. "We have this," she said, her fingers carefully smoothing the creases. It was the maintenance map Jake had pulled from behind a vertical copper pipe near the sink. The paper was stiff with dried grime, but the blue and red lines of the utility corridors were still legible. Meanwhile, Mia opened a small plastic box with a faded red cross on its lid. She counted 3 rolls of sterile gauze, a half-empty bottle of antiseptic, and a strip of adhesive bandages. "We'll make it work," Mia said, though her voice lacked conviction. Jake stood near the barricade. He braced his broad shoulder against the side of the shelving unit and shoved. The metal groaned, scraping hard against the concrete and leaving a pale gray scar on the floor. He shook his head, looking back at the others. "This shelf won't hold if they push together," Liam stated flatly. Mia pushed herself to her feet, her boots squeaking on the cold floor. "Then we don't stay here," Mia said. She stepped over to Olivia and pointed a slender finger at the faded map, tracing a bold red line that snaked away from their current position. "Look, there's a maintenance line right here. It bypasses the entire public area of the mall. It leads straight to the service exit behind the loading docks." Jake stepped closer, the beams of his flashlight cutting through the gloom of the room and casting long, dancing shadows against the brick walls. "If we go out there, we're in the dark. There's no backup power in the utility lines." "It's better than waiting here for them to break through," Olivia said. She slid a small folding camping knife into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cool patterned plastic of the handle before letting go. Liam picked up a discarded canvas bag and swept the water bottles and protein bars into it. He slung the strap over his shoulder. "No more open mall. We stay in the walls." They gathered near the secondary door, the small, narrow service door that opened into the interior corridors. Jake took a deep breath, his hand wrapping around the brass handle.
He looked back at Mia, who gave him a sharp nod. He slowly turned the knob, letting the door crack open. The back service hallway was a dark, yawning throat that smelled of old beach and sour mildew. Jake slipped through the opening first, his flashlight beam slicing the darkness to reveal a chaotic mess of peeling green paint and a tipped mop bucket that had spilled its gray, dried contents across the floor long ago. Mia stepped carefully over the plastic bucket, her sneakers making no sound on the dusty piles. Behind her, Liam pulled the heavy storage door closed with a slow, agonizingly quiet click.
Instantly, the frantic scratching and muffled groans from the main mall corridor were cut off, replaced by an oppressive, ringing silence. Olivia ran her hand along the cold cinder block wall to steady herself. The stone felt like ice against her skin, drawing the warmth right out of her fingers. Suddenly, a sharp clank resounded from somewhere deeper in the ceiling. It sounded like a heavy iron pipe shifting under pressure. They all froze. Nobody breathed. Jake held his flashlight perfectly still, the beam illuminating a rusted steel sign that read Utility Access with a faded arrow pointing down. Just a pipe, Jake whispered, though his chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid movements. They turned toward the utility door, pushing it open to find a narrow, steep flight of concrete stairs descending into the dark. The utility tunnel was tight and damp, forcing them to walk in a tense, single-file line. Liam took the lead this time, his stocky shoulders nearly brushing the damp concrete on either side. He kept his flashlight pointed down, the weak beam barely piercing the thick, heavy air. Mia walked directly behind him, keeping one hand pressed against the slimy stone wall to keep from slipping on the wet, grit-covered walkway. Every few seconds, the rhythmic plink of water dripping from overhead pipes sounded deceptively loud. "Stay close," Olivia whispered from the rear, her eyes darting back to the staircase they had just abandoned. "Keep your lights low. We don't know what's down here." The air grew colder the deeper they went, carrying the heavy metallic vibration of a distant generator humming deep within the mall's foundations. The sound was a constant, low-frequency thrum that they felt more in their teeth than in their ears. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic scraping sound echoed from a ceiling vent directly ahead. Something heavy was shifting inside the ductwork. Before anyone could react, the metal vent grate clattered to the floor with a deafening ring. A figure dropped from the ceiling, landing with a sickening, heavy thud directly onto Olivia's shoulders. It was a twisted, broken thing, its skin a bruised gray and its clothes shredded and soaked in old blood. The zombie's cracked, black-nailed fingers clawed frantically at the fabric of Olivia's heavy jacket as she shrieked, the sound of her terror bouncing off the narrow walls. "Olivia!" Jake yelled, lunging forward to grab the creature, but his boot lost traction on the wet concrete and he went down hard on one knee. Mia swung her flashlight wildly, the beam catching the zombie's pale, vacant eyes in its jaw, which hung open at an unnatural angle. A wave of rancid, decaying breath washed over them, a smell so foul it made Mia choke. The weight of the thrashing creature drove Olivia to her knees. Her hands scrambled against the wet floor, her fingers searching for anything to use as leverage. Through the glare of the swinging light, she spotted the rusted frame of an old utility cart pushed into a small alcove just inches away. Olivia drove her elbow backward with every ounce of strength she had, striking the creature directly in its rotten jaw. There was a dull crack, and the grip on her jacket loosened just enough. She lunged forward, scrambling to her feet and grabbing the sturdy metal handle of the utility cart. With a harsh grunt of effort, she shoved the heavy cart backward, its squealing wheels protesting as she rammed the flat metal front directly into the zombie's chest, pinning it hard against the stone wall. The creature hissed, its arms flailing uselessly over the top of the cart, its gray teeth snapping at the air. Jake scrambled up from the floor, his fingers wrapping around a heavy iron pipe that had fallen from the cart's lower shelf. He swung it in a short, powerful arc, bringing the metal down onto the zombie's skull with a wet, heavy crunch. The creature went limp, its head sagging forward over the side of the cart. Olivia stood there, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. A hot, dark splatter of fluid had caught her across the left cheek, and her right elbow throbbed with a dull, blooming ache from the impact. "Go! Go!" she gasped, wiping her face with her sleeve. They didn't look back. They squeezed past the pinned cart and the silent, ruined thing behind it, running deeper into the dark. They scrambled through a narrower branch of the tunnel, where bundles of black electrical wiring hung down like vines, brushing against their heads.
Mia took the lead, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts as she swept her flashlight over warning signs warning of high voltage and decaying yellow insulation. Liam kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes wide in the dark, checking to make sure nothing else was crawling through the overhead ducts. Olivia ran a trembling hand down her jacket, pulling a dusty, grease-stained rag from her pocket to wipe the remaining dark moisture from her cheek. Her hand shook so hard she almost dropped it. The tunnel made a sharp, sudden turn to the left, the wet concrete floor angling upward. "Look," Jake said, his voice tight. A thin vertical shaft of bright orange light cut through the darkness ahead, outlining the edges of a heavy steel exit door. Jake threw his weight against the door's panic bar. The rusty hinges screeched in protest as the heavy metal slab swung outward, admitting a sudden, overwhelming rush of cool, fresh evening air. They tumbled out into a narrow brick alleyway, the sky above them painted in brilliant, bruised shades of orange and deep purple. Mia leaned against the rough brick wall, taking deep, greedy gulps of the clean air, her eyes fixed on the clouds. Olivia sank down slightly, her hands resting on her knees as she tried to stop her legs from shaking. Liam quickly stepped to the edge of the loading dock, his eyes scanning the quiet alleyway. Finding it empty of any immediate movement, he turned back to the others and gave a tense nod. They stood in the deepening twilight, the cool breeze carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and burning rubber. From somewhere miles away, the rhythmic, heavy chop of helicopter blades vibrated through the air, accompanied by the distinct, distant popping of rapid gunfire. The four of them crouched low against the brickwork, their eyes drawn toward the dark silhouette of the city skyline, where the orange glow of fires began to light up the night.
Chapter 3. The Last Delivery. The cold evening air bit at Mia's face as they scrambled out of the loading dock alley. The sky was a bruised tapestry of violet and deep orange, the dying sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the ruined avenue. Debris was strewn everywhere, shattered storefront glass that crunched under their sneakers, discarded shopping bags, and drifting pages of windblown newspapers. Far off, the rhythmic thudding of helicopter rotors beat a steady pulse against the sky, accompanied by the sporadic pop of rifle fire from the eastern quarantine zone. Jake kept low, his athletic frame coiled like a spring. He crept toward a burning sedan, its tires sizzling and emitting the acrid scent of burning rubber. Peering around the blackened chassis, he raised a hand, gesturing for the others to follow. Mia moved next, her backpack bouncing against her spine. She scrambled over a fallen lamppost that lay across the asphalt like a dead giant, her eyes darting to a small blue backpack abandoned near a shattered bus shelter. The sight made her chest tighten, but there was no time to mourn the child who had dropped it. Olivia brought up the rear, her blonde bun slightly undone, her fingers clamped tightly around the handle of her knife. She kept her head spinning, scanning the shadows behind them for any movement. Liam sidestepped a drift of green glass from a broken streetlight, his stocky frame moving with deliberate, cautious speed. Every nerve in his body felt raw, vibrating with the tension of their flight. They had survived the dark tunnels beneath the mall, but the open city felt infinitely larger and more dangerous. Suddenly, a deep collective groan resounded from the intersection just a block ahead. The sound grew, a whizzing wave of guttural groans that seemed to shake the very pavement. Around the corner of the brick intersection, the vanguard of a horde appeared. There were easily 30 of them, their pale gray flesh stained with dirt and old fluids. In the fading orange light of the sunset, their milky, filmed eyes caught the glare, making them look like blind, predatory fish swimming through a sea of asphalt. Mia froze, her breath catching in her throat as she instinctively clutched Jake's arm. Her fingers dug into his jacket, her hazel eyes widening. The undead shambled forward in a loose, shifting wall, their limbs twitching, their hands outstretched with clutching fingers. The rising stench of rot drifted toward the teens, a heavy, sweet decay that made Mia's stomach churn. There were too many, Liam muttered, his voice tight as he tried to calculate their chances of slipping past. His coolie dark hair was damp with sweat. 40, maybe 40. We can't fight our way through that. Olivia looked frantically to her left and right, searching the narrow alleys and locked storefronts for any avenue of escape, but the buildings were solid brick and steel shutters.
The orange light glinted off the exposed, broken teeth of the lead creatures as they picked up speed, their uneven feet scraping against the dry asphalt. Liam's eyes locked onto a white delivery truck parked curbside, only 20 yards away. Its rear metal doors were slightly ajar, swaying in an even breeze. "Truck, now!" Liam yelled, grabbing Olivia's wrist and pulling her forward before she could protest. The sudden movement broke the spell of her panic. Mia and Jake sprinted right behind them, their boots pounding a frantic rhythm on the pavement. The horde reacted instantly, their groans rising to a shrill, hungry crescendo as they lunged toward the noise. A mangled bicycle lay directly in the path, its frame twisted into a knot of crawl. Jake leaped over it clean, but Mia's foot caught back.
She yanked herself forward with a desperate cry, the fabric ripping open just as the cold, black-rimmed fingernails of an advancing zombie scraped against the nylon of her backpack. Liam reached the truck first, slamming his weight against the left rear door to fling it open. "Get in! Move! Move!" The cold metal of the door handle slammed against the outer wall of the truck with a loud clang. Jake grabbed Mia's hand, hoisting her up into the dark cargo hold. Olivia scrambled in right behind them, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The thud of the approaching horde was deafening now, the shuffling footsteps sounding like a heavy rainstorm on concrete. Liam leaped in last, and both he and Jake grabbed the inner handles, slamming the heavy door shut. The interior of the cargo hold plunged into near total darkness, saved only by thin cracks of sunset slicing through the door seams. Almost immediately, the first heavy blow struck the exterior. A sickening, hollow metallic boom reverberated through the compartment as a body collided with the back of the truck. "Hold the doors!" Jake shouted, throwing his broad shoulders against the shaking metal. Liam joined him, planting his feet firmly against the corrugated floor, his teeth bared as he strained against the rising pressure. Outside, dozens of hands began to hammer the metal panels, the force of their impact creating deep inward dents in the aluminum skin of the vehicle. The entire truck began to rock from side to side, swaying on its suspension under the weight of the pressing crowd. Mia didn't waste a second. Spotting the small crawlway that led into the driver's cabin, she dropped to her knees. She squeezed her slight frame through the narrow opening, ignoring the rough edges that scraped her back. In the back, Olivia pulled a flashlight from her canvas bag and clicked it on. The beam danced across the ceiling and walls, illuminating the growing dimples in the metal as the horde battered their shelter. The air inside the hold was suffocating, thick with the smell of old cardboard, greasy engine oil, and the faint dusty scent of long-lost deliveries. Mia scrambled into the driver's seat, her hands sweeping over the dashboard. Her trembling fingers brushed against something metal and cold dangling from the steering column. It was a ring of keys. "I've got the keys!" Mia screamed over the deafening din of the hammering fists. She grabbed the heavy ring, found the ignition, and shoved the key inside. With a prayer muttered under her breath, she twisted her wrist. The engine groaned, sputtered, and died. Outside, the rocking grew more violent. The truck felt as though it might tip over entirely. "Mia, do it now!" Jake yelled from the back, his voice strained as he and Liam were pushed inches away from the doors. She turned the key again, stomping on the gas pedal. The starter cranked, and then, with a thunderous roar that shook the entire frame, the diesel engine caught. Mia slammed the gear stick into drive and floored the accelerator. The delivery truck lunged forward with a violent jerk. There was a sickening, rhythmic series of impacts as the heavy Ford bumper slammed into the dense pack of zombies. Bones crunched under the massive tires, and a thick, dark fluid sprayed across the windshield, obscuring the view of the street ahead. Olivia grabbed a hanging cargo strap to keep from being thrown against the metal walls, while Jake lost his footing, tumbling onto a pile of old blankets before pulling himself back up. The engine roared louder as the wheels caught traction over the crushed bodies. With a final, heavy jolt, the truck broke free of the intersection and barreled down the wide, debris-strewn avenue. Mia gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, her hazel eyes locked on the road ahead. She weaved the heavy vehicle violently, dodging stalled sedans, abandoned SUVs, and piles of Boeing trash. A bright red mailbox clipped the passenger side mirror, sending it spinning into a brick wall with a sharp crack, but she didn't slow down. In the back, Liam dragged himself up to the small, grimy window in the rear door. He wiped away a layer of dust with his sleeve and peered out into the twilight. "We're clear!" he called out, his voice cracking with relief. "Nothing is following us. We left them behind."
Jake scrambled through the cabin partition, dropping into the passenger seat next to Mia, before turning back to check on Olivia. Olivia sat on the floor of the cargo bay, her glasses slightly askew, her breathing heavy but steady. "You okay?" Jake asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Olivia nodded, pushing her glasses back up her nose. "Just a little bruised. I'm fine." The wind whistled sharply through a shattered side window, carrying the taste of grit and the smell of hot motor oil into the cabin. Waste paper and dust swirled around their feet in miniature cyclones as the truck sped further away from the mall. Up ahead, the dark skyline began to give way to brilliant, artificial light. "Look," Mia said, pointing through the stained windshield. Blinding white searchlights cut through the twilight, illuminating a massive barricade constructed of sandbags, concrete blocks, and coiled razor wire. Mia slammed her foot onto the brake pedal. The tires squealed, and the truck skidded sideways, coming to a halt 20 feet from the barrier. Almost instantly, a dozen soldiers wearing combat gear rose from behind the sandbags, their rifles trained directly on the truck's windshield. "Hands up! Exit the vehicle slowly!" a voice barked through a megaphone, the sound amplified and distorted. Mia immediately raised her trembling hands, keeping them visible above the dashboard. The blinding glare of the spotlights washed over them, making it impossible to see the faces behind the weapons. Overhead, the heavy thumping of a military helicopter drowned out all other sounds as it swept past. Jake leaned toward the broken side window, raising his hands high. "Don't shoot!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. "We're just kids! We're not bitten! We came from the mall!" The soldiers held their positions, their fingers tense on their triggers. The metallic clatter of safeties disengaging echoed through the quiet night air. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Then a figure in a green uniform stepped through a gap in the sandbags. Sergeant Reyes walked with measured, confident steps toward the truck, her hand resting on the holster at her hip. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp, weathered features and steely eyes that seemed to take in everything at a glance. "Out of the vehicle, one by one, hands where I can see them," Reyes commanded, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Mia opened the door and stepped down onto the cold asphalt, her legs shaking so violently she could barely stand. Jake, Olivia, and Liam followed, keeping their hands high. Reyes approached Mia first, pulling a small silver penlight from her pocket. She flicked it on, shining the bright beam into Mia's hazel eyes, checking her pupils, before gesturing for her to pull back her sleeves. Methodically, she inspected Mia's wrists, neck, and collarbone for any tears in the skin. She repeated the process with Jake and Liam, her movements efficient and practiced. When she reached Olivia, a medic in a white vest stepped forward to inspect a dark stain on her sleeve. Olivia flinched slightly as the medic dabbed at a scrape on her elbow with an antiseptic wipe, but the skin was unbroken. "They're clean," Reyes called out, turning back to her men. She flicked off her penlight. "Get them to the aid station." A soldier stepped forward, draping heavy, rough wool blankets over their shoulders. The sudden warmth was overwhelming. Nearby, the steady, rhythmic whir of a diesel generator filled the air, providing a strange sense of normal utility amidst the chaos. They were guided through the maze of razor wire and sandbags toward a large olive-drab tent marked with a stark red cross. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic, canvas, and clean linen. Mia sat on the edge of a canvas cot, wrapping the rough blanket tightly around herself. Her hands were still shaking as a medic handed her a small paper cup of water. She took a sip, the cool liquid soothing her dry, dusty throat, before passing the cup to Jake. Jake drank deeply, his broad shoulders finally relaxing as he leaned back against the frame of the cot. Beside him, Olivia stared silently at her torn jacket sleeve, her expression unreadable behind her glasses. The adrenaline was finally leaving their systems, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Liam sat hunched over on the opposite cot, his head buried in his hands. He listened to the distant, muffled popping of gunfire and the static-filled chatter of military radios coming from the main command tent. It was clear the battle for the city was still raging just beyond the barricades. Mia looked at her friends, her voice barely a whisper. "We made it," she said. The words felt incredibly hollow. They had survived, but the relief was tempered by the overwhelming weight of what they had lost. They were safe, yet their entire world had ended in the span of a single afternoon.
Drawn by a flickering light, the four of them slowly stood up and walked to the opening of the tent. They pulled back the canvas flap, looking back toward the western horizon. The city skyline was a dark, jagged silhouette against a sky painted in shades of charcoal and blood red. Thick plumes of black smoke rose from the center of town, illuminated from below by the orange glow of unchecked fires. Somewhere deep in that darkness lay the Meadowview Mall, its massive structure now nothing more than a giant tomb for thousands of souls. Jake placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Mia's shoulder, squeezing gently. Olivia wiped away a single tear that had cut a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "The mole," Liam said, his voice cracking slightly as he stared into the distance. "It's a tomb now." Just beyond the perimeter of the checkpoint, past the bright floodlights and the layers of razor wire, dark shapes began to gather. They pressed against the barricades, their pale faces illuminated by the perimeter lights. They didn't scream or run. They simply stood there, patient and hungry, their collective groans rising on the cool night wind. The four friends stood together at the edge of the safe zone, holding on to one another, watching the darkness slowly swallow the rest of their